Airports have a strange rhythm, an unspoken hierarchy that reveals itself in glances, luggage brands, and the quiet tension between those who can wait and those who can't. The hum of engines outside was the soundtrack to another day in the air, but inside the terminal, a different storm was brewing, the kind that didn't involve clouds or turbulence. The narrator of this story, an off-duty federal air marshal, moved through the terminal unnoticed, just another traveler in jeans and a plain polo shirt. His badge and firearm were secure beneath layers of calm professionalism and casual anonymity. To anyone watching, he was just an ordinary passenger waiting for a flight to Atlanta. But what most people never realize is that the quietest person on board might be the one ensuring everyone gets there safely. He wasn't on assignment, not officially. His job had trained him to see potential threats in every scenario, to read the small details others missed, the slight tremor in a hand, the shift in body language, the way tension built between strangers in a confined space. All of it was second nature by now. But today, the mission was simpler. Travel home after a security seminar, grab some rest, and maybe get a decent cup of coffee before the next rotation. The gate area was unusually crowded for a mid-morning flight. A mechanical issue with an earlier plane had delayed boarding, which meant agitation was in the air long before anyone even stepped onto the aircraft. A flight delay is a spark. All it needs is one impatient match to ignite something bigger. That match came in the form of a woman in her mid-50s, clutching a designer handbag and a level of entitlement that seemed immune to reason. Her voice carried across the terminal, sharp, nasal, and dripping with disdain. She wasn't yelling, not exactly, but she spoke with that dangerous confidence of someone used to getting her way, the kind of person who believed customer service existed for her alone. She had that unmistakable aura, the practiced scowl, the tapping foot, the performative sigh, the sort of presence that could turn an ordinary inconvenience into a public spectacle. She complained about the gate agents, about the lack of respect, about how people these days had no manners. The marshal noticed her the way a cop notices a traffic violation, instinctively, without meaning to. Not because she was a threat, but because she was unpredictable. And unpredictability in an airport can be just as concerning as hostility. He watched her cut in front of a young couple, scoffing when they hesitated. He watched her gesture toward a man in a worn uniform, muttering something that made his shoulders tense. And when pre-boarding was finally announced for first-class passengers, she was the first to move, chin lifted like royalty, eyes darting toward anyone who dared to question her right to be first. The marshal's boarding group was called Next, Group 1, reserved for priority travelers and government personnel. He stepped forward calmly, boarding pass ready, letting the woman's perfume and sharp movements announce her before he ever reached the gate scanner. Inside the jet bridge, the air grew thick with recycled humidity and anticipation. The woman's voice echoed again, this time directed toward the flight attendant at the door. Something about being sure her seat was next to someone appropriate. It wasn't loud enough to be a scene yet, but it carried that venomous tone of someone measuring others by appearance. When the marshal entered the cabin, he instantly noticed the contrast between first class and economy, the muted luxury, the subtle tension, the unspoken competition for armrests and overhead bins. He found his seat, 2A, near the window. And then, of course, came the sound of her voice again. She was seated in 2B. He didn't flinch. Training had taught him to maintain composure under far worse conditions. Still, he could feel her eyes scanning him, evaluating, categorizing. There was a pause, then a faint scoff. That sound people make when they believe they've just identified someone who doesn't belong. She shifted in her seat, making subtle but intentional gestures, moving her handbag, straightening her posture, turning slightly away. It was small, but it carried volumes. She muttered under her breath something like, "People like you." The phrase hung in the air like turbulence that hadn't hit yet. It wasn't shouted, but it was enough. enough to pierce through the soft hum of pre-flight chatter, enough for nearby passengers to glance up in curiosity. The marshal didn't respond. He didn't need to. Years of law enforcement had taught him that silence is often the most powerful answer. Still, internally, he cataloged the event like evidence: tone, phrasing, intent. It wasn't the first time he'd seen entitlement dressed as confidence, or prejudice disguised as concern. But this one had an edge to her, a sense of moral immunity that made her believe every word she spoke was justified. The flight attendants were still organizing the cabin, smiling through exhaustion, checking seat belts and storage bins. The marshal leaned back slightly, letting the rhythm of the plane settle. He had a feeling this flight was going to be longer than the itinerary suggested. As the engines started their low, thunderous rumble, he caught the woman's reflection in the window, her lips moving as if she were rehearsing some internal monologue about how unfair the world was. And though he wanted to ignore it, part of his mind couldn't help but assess the situation through a professional lens. Passengers like her were rarely physical threats, but they could cause chain reactions, verbal escalations, unnecessary diversions, potential safety incidents. He knew that all too well. As the plane pushed back from the gate, the cabin dimmed. The hum of the engines deepened, and for a moment, peace settled. But deep down, he knew that peace wouldn't last long. The woman's entitlement wasn't finished speaking. It never was. And before this flight reached cruising altitude, she was going to make a mistake. A big one. The kind of mistake that would remind everyone on board that sometimes the quiet stranger sitting next to you isn't just another passenger. He's the one person you never want to test.
The flight took off into a silver morning sky, engines growling with familiar determination. The seatbelt sign flickered off, and the cabin began its slow transformation from tension to mild comfort. A few passengers unbuckled, stretching legs that already felt cramped. Coffee orders were placed, trays clicked open, and the low hum of conversation filled the space between rows. For a brief moment, it felt almost peaceful. The air marshal leaned back, observing quietly, the way he always did. From behind his mirrored sunglasses, the world was a shifting tapestry of human behavior. Small gestures, fleeting reactions, the endless theater of air travel. He wasn't here to enforce anything today, not unless he had to. But old habits die hard. His mind still analyzed the cabin layout automatically. 2 flight attendants up front, 2 more in the rear, emergency exits aligned with row numbers he knew by heart. Everything seemed ordinary, until she spoke again. The woman in 2B hadn't been able to stay silent for long. Entitlement rarely could. It began with a sigh, heavy and deliberate, meant to be heard. Then came a series of muttered complaints about legroom, air temperature, the quality of the pre-flight champagne. She moved with restless authority, pressing buttons on the seat controls, adjusting her blanket, and glancing repeatedly toward the flight attendants with expectant impatience. She leaned slightly toward the aisle, trying to catch the attention of one of them, a young woman barely in her 20s, still mastering the art of smiling through condescension. The attendant offered a polite nod and asked what she could assist with, but the Karen's tone turned sharp, like a blade coated in honey. The marshal couldn't hear every word, but he caught enough. The woman didn't just want assistance, she wanted superiority acknowledged. Her voice rose just enough to claim territory, her complaints dressed in the language of civility, but laced with insult. Then it happened. The sentence that would change the tone of the entire flight slipped from her lips like a spark catching dry grass. She looked directly at the air marshal beside her, at his plain clothes, his quiet posture, the lack of an expensive watch or branded luggage, and said, clear enough for at least 3 rows to hear, "People like you shouldn't sit in first class." There it was. The phrase that always revealed everything. The nearby passengers fell silent. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade for a heartbeat. Her tone wasn't curious or conversational. It was accusatory, dripping with the unspoken assumption that she was the kind of person who belonged here, and he wasn't. The marshal didn't move. His face stayed unreadable. Years of tactical training and interrogations had sculpted him into a master of composure. He let her words pass through the air like smoke, settling without reaction. But inside, the analytical part of his brain began recording. Tone, hostile. Intent, discriminatory. Threat, not physical, yet. Risk, potential escalation. He didn't look at her, didn't even blink. Silence, he'd learned, is sometimes the most disarming weapon of all. But silence made her restless. When a person like that doesn't get the reaction they expect, they often double down. She shifted in her seat, crossed her legs dramatically, and spoke louder, this time to no one in particular, but loud enough to gather witnesses. She began describing how standards have dropped, how first class isn't what it used to be, and how anyone can buy a seat these days. Her words danced with venom, each one seeking validation from the strangers around her. The woman across the aisle, a business traveler in a navy blazer, stiffened but kept her eyes down. A man in 3A frowned but didn't speak. People rarely did. It's easier to let unpleasantness exist than to confront it. The marshal stayed still, his gaze fixed on the seat back ahead, though his mind was nothing but still. He wasn't angry. Anger was unproductive. What he felt was something sharper. Anticipation. Because passengers like her had a way of revealing themselves completely, given enough time, and an audience. The flight attendant returned, offering a small smile, trying to maintain professionalism. She handed the woman her drink, only to be met with a glare. Something about the glass not being clean enough. Another sigh, another complaint. The same cycle. But the thing about confined spaces is that every word echoes, and every ounce of entitlement builds pressure. Eventually, pressure finds a release point. An hour into the flight, turbulence began, a light rolling tremor that made the overhead lights flicker slightly. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady, advising passengers to fasten their seatbelts until it passed. Most complied immediately, but not her. She pressed the call button again. A chime rang out, drawing subtle glances from the surrounding rows. The flight attendant returned, politely reminding her that service was temporarily paused due to turbulence. That should have been the end of it. But entitlement doesn't like being told no. Her voice rose, not shouting, but sharp and cutting. She demanded to speak to a supervisor. She questioned the competence of the staff. And finally, she gestured toward the air marshal beside her, declaring, loud enough for half the cabin to hear, that she didn't feel comfortable sitting next to him. That single phrase was enough to change everything. Eyes turned, the quiet hum of the plane shifted into an uneasy silence. The woman's accusation hung there, ambiguous, but dangerous. In the world of air travel, even a whisper of discomfort or suspicion could mean scrutiny, delay, escalation. The marshal's heartbeat didn't rise. His breathing didn't quicken. He'd been in standoffs, interrogations, and mid-air emergencies. This was nothing new. But he knew exactly how perception worked and how fast rumors could spiral if unchecked. The lead flight attendant, a calm, older man with the voice of experience, approached. He listened politely as the woman began recounting a twisted version of events, implying impropriety where there was none. Her story grew with each sentence, her discomfort exaggerated, her tone performative. The marshal simply handed over his ID, still silent. A small badge glinted briefly in the overhead light, and the flight attendant's entire demeanor changed. Respect replaced skepticism. Calm replaced concern. The woman didn't notice. She kept talking. She didn't realize the magnitude of her mistake, because while she saw only what her prejudice allowed her to see, someone beneath her, she had in fact just accused the one person aboard legally authorized to detain a passenger mid-air. The turbulence subsided, but the tension didn't. The attendant excused himself politely, whispering something to a colleague before stepping into the galley. The marshal leaned back once more, letting the silence reclaim the space. The woman still believed she was winning, but soon she'd learn that every flight has rules, and every rule has consequences. And by the time they landed, the story she thought she was controlling would belong to someone else entirely.
The hum of the engines steadied as the aircraft sliced through a soft layer of clouds. the sky outside a pale ocean of light. Inside the cabin, however, the atmosphere had shifted. Something unseen but tangible hung in the air, a quiet collective awareness that something had just happened. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic. It was the kind of silence that followed a social collision, the kind where people pretend to read or sleep while their minds replay what they just witnessed. The passengers near row 2 had seen enough to know something wasn't right, even if they didn't yet understand the full scope. The woman in 2B sat rigidly now, arms folded, face tilted slightly toward the window. Her lips were tight, her posture composed in a way that tried to disguise discomfort. She still believed she was in control, still believed she had simply handled an unpleasant encounter. But a faint tremor in her fingers betrayed something else: uncertainty. The air marshal, still composed, leaned back in his seat. His face betrayed nothing, but his senses were alive, scanning, noting, processing. He wasn't thinking about revenge or embarrassment. That wasn't how he operated. His mind was on the chain reaction that behavior like hers could set off in a pressurized cabin 30,000 feet above the ground. When a passenger accuses another of making them feel unsafe, procedures activate, quietly but firmly. It's not just gossip, it's protocol. And though he wasn't on duty in the official sense, he knew those wheels were already turning behind the scenes. Within minutes, the lead flight attendant returned. His demeanor was polite but purposeful, the practiced calm of someone trained to defuse situations without fanfare. He leaned toward the marshal and murmured something too soft for anyone else to hear. The marshal nodded once, showing his ID again, this time discreetly, confirming what the crew now understood. He wasn't just a passenger. He was protection. The attendant gave a subtle nod in return, a silent acknowledgement of shared understanding. Then he turned his attention briefly toward the woman in 2B, checking on her with the same professional neutrality. She responded with that practiced tone of superiority, insisting she'd been made uncomfortable and expected better from this airline. He smiled politely, said he'd note her feedback, and walked away. For a few minutes, peace returned, or the illusion of it. Drinks were poured. The flight attendants moved quietly up and down the aisle, their expressions calm but knowing. But anyone who's ever been on a flight like that understands that energy lingers. The woman continued glancing toward the front galley every few minutes, suspicious, restless, as if trying to gauge whether people were talking about her. They were. 2 rows back, whispers began, low, cautious, curious. Passengers piecing together fragments, wondering what exactly had happened. Someone had heard the phrase, "people like you." Someone else mentioned the flash of a badge. Word traveled the way it always does in close quarters, through glances, half smiles, and quiet speculation. The marshal sat still, eyes closed, arms resting loosely on the armrests. On the surface, he looked asleep. In reality, his mind was calmly reviewing standard in-flight response scenarios. He knew he wouldn't need to act unless she escalated again, but he also knew that people like her rarely stopped once they'd convinced themselves they were victims of their own behavior. And he was right. It began subtly. She pressed the call button again, this time under the guise of a simple question. When the attendant approached, she lowered her voice, too soft for nearby passengers to hear, but her tone was sharp, almost conspiratorial. The marshal couldn't make out every word, but the message was clear enough. She wanted the crew to do something about the man beside her. The attendant's response was polite, but firm. He explained that the passenger beside her was cleared and that there was no issue to address. Her face tightened. She didn't like that answer. People who thrive on control rarely handle being told no twice. She shifted tactics. Her voice grew just loud enough for others to hear. She began complaining again, not directly about the marshal now, but about the way things are run, about how anyone can buy a ticket these days, about how safety standards have slipped. Every sentence was crafted to sound like opinion, but carried an unmistakable undertone. The woman in the aisle seat across from her finally looked up, meeting her gaze with quiet disapproval. The Karen noticed, faltered for a moment, then turned back to the window. The marshal didn't react. Not a word, not a glance. His silence was unnerving her now. She shifted in her seat again, uncomfortable under the weight of her own echo chamber. Then came the second round of turbulence, stronger this time. The seatbelt sign blinked on, and the captain's voice returned, advising passengers to remain seated. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, creating that strange cocoon of uneasy quiet that only happens mid-flight. The aircraft rocked gently, then steadied. Drinks sloshed. Overhead bins rattled faintly. The sound of the engines grew deeper, like a steady heartbeat beneath the floor. She tensed, gripping her armrest. Fear flickered across her face for the first time, fleeting but real. In that moment, she wasn't in control anymore, of the plane, of the crew, or even of her own composure. The marshal opened his eyes, calm and unbothered, his focus shifting from her to the front of the cabin. He could tell the crew had already discussed how to handle her. He'd seen that subtle coordination before, the quiet glances, the slightly altered routes down the aisle. They were managing her presence now, and she could feel it. Her attempts to regain attention fell flat. Her complaints went unanswered. Her superiority, once unshakable, was beginning to crack. The isolation was settling in, the realization that the room, or in this case the cabin, no longer responded to her performance. The turbulence eased, but her temper did not. She pressed the call button again. No one came immediately. Seconds stretched, and with each one her frustration grew more visible. She shifted, muttered, checked her watch, sighed. She wanted the power back. She wanted an audience again. But no one was watching anymore, at least not the way she hoped. The passengers near her avoided eye contact. The attendants remained polite but distant. Even the man beside her, the one she'd insulted, seemed entirely unaffected, which somehow made her angrier. It's a strange kind of justice, the quiet kind, the one where a person realizes they've lost influence not because someone shouted them down, but because everyone simply stopped believing in their authority. The marshal leaned slightly to the window, glancing at the wing outside, streaked with sunlight. He could feel the weight of her discomfort beside him, heavy and self-inflicted. He didn't need to say a word, because the truth was already spreading, quietly but effectively. The attendants knew who he was now, so did the pilot. And soon enough, the woman who believed she could manipulate a situation with arrogance alone would learn exactly how wrong she'd been. For now, though, silence was punishment enough. The cabin stayed quiet for the next hour, eerily so. But calm before consequence is always temporary, and the moment that calm broke, everything she'd built on false confidence would come crashing down at 35,000 feet.
The aircraft cruised above the clouds now, the world below invisible beneath a soft, endless sheet of white. It was that strange part of every flight where time stopped mattering, where everyone on board seemed caught between destinations, between worlds. Some passengers read, some slept, some simply stared into the endless blue, lost in their own thoughts. But not everyone was at peace. The woman in 2B shifted again, fidgeting with the hem of her jacket, checking her watch every few minutes. The polished confidence she'd worn like armor during boarding was beginning to crack under the slow pressure of isolation. The people around her weren't engaging anymore.
The attendant's politeness had turned mechanical, detached. Even the hum of idle conversation from the rows behind her seemed to exclude her now. Entitlement, when deprived of attention, begins to starve, and starving egos don't go quietly. The air marshal could sense the tension building again before she even moved. He didn't need to look. He could feel it, the restless energy of someone who needed control and couldn't find it. The stillness was driving her mad. She pressed the call button again, harder this time, holding it for a second as if that would make a difference. The soft chime rang out. Heads turned subtly, eyes flicking toward her row, then away again. Everyone knew who was summoning attention this time. A flight attendant approached, her expression calm but weary. She knelt slightly to meet the passenger's eye level, the universal body language of service professionals trying to contain a situation before it escalates. The woman's voice was sharp but hushed, the kind of whisper meant to sound discreet but that still carried across the rows. She complained again about the service, about unprofessionalism, about how she shouldn't have to sit next to someone who made her uncomfortable. The attendant listened, nodding politely, but this time there was no apology, no reassurance, just the quiet firmness of someone following protocol. She explained that the crew had confirmed everything was in order, that there was no issue to address, and that the passenger beside her was cleared by the airline. It was the truth. But to the woman in 2B, the truth felt like defiance. Her face hardened. She leaned back in her seat, lips pressed thin, eyes flashing with the silent outrage of someone unused to losing control. She muttered something under her breath, words that were meant to sting, but came out hollow, lost under the hum of the engines. For a few minutes, she sat motionless, staring out the window. The air marshal almost believed she'd decided to let it go. But then, as if on cue, she reached for her phone. It began innocently enough, her camera lens glinting in the cabin light as she angled the phone discreetly toward the aisle. A quick snapshot of the flight attendant. Then another pointed slightly toward the marshal beside her. That's when things quietly shifted from rude to serious. Photography or recording on flights isn't just impolite. It can cross into a violation of privacy and, in certain contexts, security protocol, especially when aimed at a federal air marshal. The marshal's eyes opened slowly. He turned his head just enough to confirm what he already knew. She wasn't filming for fun. She was gathering evidence, the kind of footage people use to support online tirades about mistreatment or unfair treatment. He'd seen it before, entitled passengers trying to rewrite the narrative mid-flight, crafting a story before it had even finished happening. And while he didn't mind being misjudged, what he couldn't allow was misinformation that could disrupt flight operations or threaten crew authority. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he caught the eye of the lead flight attendant as she walked past. A single glance, a silent exchange, a practiced form of communication between people trained to read situations quickly. Within moments, the attendant discreetly informed the captain. A few minutes later, the seatbelt sign flickered back on, not because of turbulence this time, but because the crew needed control. The cabin announcement came in the captain's calm, steady voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, for everyone's safety, we ask that passengers remain seated as we address a minor issue in the forward cabin." It was polite, neutral, vague enough not to alarm anyone, but the message was clear to those who understood. The woman in 2B stiffened. She looked around, trying to read the situation, trying to decide if this sudden change had something to do with her. The marshal stayed perfectly still, watching the reflection of her confusion in the window. The lead flight attendant returned, crouching beside her seat, with composed professionalism. His voice was calm, quiet, and firm. He informed her that recording or photographing crew and passengers without consent was not permitted.
He asked her to delete the photos and put the phone away. She blinked, stunned that anyone would confront her so directly. Then came the familiar defense, the raised eyebrows, the exaggerated disbelief, and the beginning of another self-justifying speech. But this time, it went nowhere, because before she could finish, the attendant added a single, carefully chosen phrase. "Ma'am, this is a federal matter." She froze. The words landed like a weight. Federal. It's a small word with enormous gravity when spoken mid-flight. He gestured briefly toward the man sitting beside her, still calm, still silent. She followed the motion, her eyes widening slightly as she saw for the first time the faint reflection of his badge against the window's edge. It hit her then. The man she had insulted, the one she had tried to have removed, the one she had accused of making her uncomfortable, was the very person the airline and the government trusted most to protect every passenger on board. Her throat tightened. She tried to form words, but none came out. Her face shifted through a dozen shades of realization: denial, embarrassment, fear, disbelief. The flight attendant's voice stayed gentle but firm, as he explained that the incident would be documented, that her behavior had been noted, and that federal law required her compliance. The passengers nearby pretended not to listen, but every ear in first class was tuned in now. The woman nodded quickly, stammering a quiet apology that never reached full volume. She unlocked her phone, deleted the photos under supervision, and placed it face down on the tray table. Her hands trembled slightly. The marshal remained silent. He didn't smirk, he didn't gloat. He simply nodded once to the attendant, a signal that the matter was resolved, for now. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Embarrassment filled the air like static, the kind of silence that doesn't fade quickly. The woman kept her gaze down, fidgeting with the edge of a napkin. She didn't press the call button again, didn't speak, didn't even look out the window. For the first time all flight, she looked small, unmasked, uncertain. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. The aircraft remained steady, gliding smoothly toward Atlanta. The marshal leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the steady rhythm of the engines. The incident was over, but something told him her story wasn't, because people like her rarely stop at embarrassment. They try to reclaim the narrative. And he knew, from experience, that sometimes the real turbulence doesn't begin until after you land.
The rest of the flight passed under a thick, fragile layer of calm, the kind that wasn't quite peace, but wasn't conflict either, a kind of suspended silence. The hum of the engines filled the space where words had once been, masking the quiet discomfort that lingered in the first-class cabin. Most passengers had returned to their routines, earbuds in, tablets glowing faintly, pages of books turning softly. But no one forgot what had happened. Everyone knew that something had shifted when the words "federal matter" were spoken. It wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. The woman in 2B sat with her hands folded tightly on her lap now, staring at the pattern of the seat in front of her as though it might offer escape. Every so often, she adjusted her posture, small, nervous movements betraying the anxiety that still simmered beneath her carefully blank expression. Her earlier arrogance had drained away, replaced with an uneasy quiet. The air marshal, meanwhile, sat as he always did, still, steady, observant. From the outside, he looked utterly unbothered, but inside he was alert. He knew human nature well enough to expect one last attempt at control before this was over. When people like her lose public power, they often seek private vindication. And the landing, with its shuffle of activity and brief loosening of restraint, is the perfect opportunity for that. The captain's voice eventually filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into Atlanta. Please ensure seatbacks and tray tables are in their upright and locked positions." The aircraft began its slow, graceful drop through the clouds. Outside the window, the sky shifted from endless blue to a patchwork of white and gray, then to a faint golden hue as the sun glinted off the distant horizon. The seatbelt sign returned with a soft chime, and the usual rhythm began. Attendants checking belts, securing carts, ensuring compliance. The marshal fastened his seatbelt calmly. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her doing the same. Her movements were stiff, deliberate, as if each one was being performed under scrutiny. The plane shuddered slightly as it passed through a thin pocket of turbulence. She gasped quietly, a reflex, but quickly composed herself. Even now, she wanted to seem in control. The marshal glanced around the cabin. Everything was routine. The attendants' faces were neutral again, though the faint tension in their eyes betrayed that they hadn't forgotten either. The situation had been handled, but not forgotten. As the wheels touched down with a firm thud, a collective breath rippled through the passengers. The familiar roar of reverse thrust filled the air, and the aircraft slowed along the runway. The marshal always liked that moment, the first solid contact after hours of uncertainty, the simple physical reminder that the journey was almost done. The plane taxied toward the gate, sunlight flashing across the windows. The woman in 2B began gathering her belongings quickly, far too quickly, as if eager to escape. Her bag was already unzipped before the captain even gave the signal to move. But then came the announcement, calm and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that passengers seated in the first 2 rows remain seated momentarily as we complete an additional verification procedure. The marshal didn't move. He'd been expecting this. The airline had already been in contact with ground security during descent. It was standard practice for disruptive passengers. Nothing dramatic, just quiet accountability. The woman blinked, confused at first, then realized the entire cabin had paused. Her confusion turned quickly to defensiveness. She looked around as if searching for support, but none came. The attendant's professionalism was unwavering. Within moments, 2 uniformed airport security officers stepped quietly onto the plane. Their demeanor was neutral, respectful, but unmistakably authoritative. They spoke briefly with the lead attendant, who gestured subtly toward row 2. The woman's face drained of color. The marshal stayed seated, eyes forward, expression unreadable. He wasn't the one addressing her. He didn't need to. The situation had outgrown her narrative. The officers approached her seat calmly. One leaned slightly, speaking in a low voice. Passengers couldn't hear the words, but they could read the tone. It was procedural, not punitive. She wasn't being arrested, just escorted for questioning. A standard follow-up for mid-air incidents that involved a report or documentation. Her voice, small now, trembled as she tried to explain. She gestured vaguely toward the marshal, toward her seat, toward anything that might shift the focus away from her. But the officers were unmoved. They simply asked her to gather her belongings and follow them off the plane. The walk from row 2 to the exit took less than 10 seconds, but to her it must have felt like an eternity. Every pair of eyes in the cabin followed her, not out of malice, but out of the quiet human fascination that comes from watching arrogance meet consequence. She kept her chin up, but her posture betrayed her. The once proud stride had become hesitant. Her steps faltered slightly as she reached the door. The attendants thanked her for her cooperation. The officers thanked the crew, and then she was gone. The door closed again briefly as the crew completed the post-landing protocol. Passengers began whispering softly now, the tension breaking like a cracked dam. The mood had changed, from discomfort to relief. The marshal remained in his seat, waiting until the last few passengers had disembarked. The lead attendant approached quietly, his voice low and respectful. He thanked him, not in a grand gesture, but in that quiet, professional way that acknowledged understanding without spectacle. The marshal nodded once. Just doing my job. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. When he finally stepped off the aircraft, the air outside felt different, fresh, grounded, clean. The airport buzzed with its usual chaos, but after the confined intensity of the cabin, it felt strangely liberating.
He watched as the officers led the woman away toward a private area near the jet bridge. She wasn't in handcuffs. This wasn't punishment. It was accountability. She'd be questioned, her statements reviewed, her behavior documented. Likely, she'd leave with nothing more than embarrassment and a note in her passenger record. But the real consequence wasn't written on paper. It was the look on her face, the dawning understanding that her assumptions, her superiority, and her certainty had collided with something immovable. She wanted power. She tried to take control of a situation she never understood. And in doing so, she'd handed that control to the very person she'd dismissed. As the marshal walked through the terminal, blending again into the sea of travelers, he didn't feel pride or anger, just quiet reflection. He'd seen hundreds of incidents like this one, each a reminder that arrogance and ignorance often travel hand in hand, that respect is weightless, yet priceless. And somewhere, far above them all, the plane that had carried that quiet storm was already being prepped for its next flight. Another set of passengers, another journey, another chance for grace or its absence to reveal itself. Because in the sky, at 35,000 feet, everyone is equal. It's only when we land that some people remember their place again.
By the next morning, the story had already begun its quiet evolution. What had started as a tense, confined encounter in the narrow cabin of Flight 287 was now rippling outward, subtle at first, but unstoppable. It began the way these stories always do, a whisper in the airport lounge, a murmur in a ride share, a retelling to friends over morning coffee. Someone who'd been in row 3 mentioned it casually to a coworker. "You won't believe what happened on my flight yesterday." The story took shape, layer by layer, as each retelling added tone, color, and disbelief. And soon, it reached the online world. A passenger from business class posted a brief, vague message on social media. No names, no details, just a single line that read, "Watching karma unfold 35,000 feet in the air is something I'll never forget." That was all it took. Comments followed, filled with curiosity. People wanted context. Someone else chimed in, another passenger, confirming that a woman in first class had caused a scene, insulting another traveler who turned out to be a federal air marshal. The thread grew. Dozens of people shared it, then hundreds. The story became a modern fable, a cautionary tale about arrogance and assumption. The marshal himself, of course, stayed silent. He had no interest in attention. His role wasn't to trend, it was to protect. Still, he couldn't help but notice the irony. The woman who had tried so hard to control perception was now the subject of a narrative she couldn't rewrite. And in that there was a lesson. Not one he needed to teach, but one the world seemed eager to learn. Meanwhile, at the airport's operations office, the official report made its way through the proper channels. It was brief, factual, and devoid of emotion. The language was bureaucratic. Passenger exhibited disruptive behavior. Incident resolved with assistance from onboard federal personnel. No further action required. Just another entry in a system that saw thousands like it every year. But what no report could capture was the human aftermath, the quiet reckoning that follows public embarrassment. For the woman, that reckoning began almost immediately. She had left the airport the night before in silence, escorted only until the questioning was complete. She wasn't charged, she wasn't banned, but she wasn't the same. There's something about being stripped of false authority in front of strangers that leaves a mark deeper than any fine or citation. In her world, a life built on appearances, influence, and social standing, control was everything, and she had lost it spectacularly. The next morning she sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. The posts were everywhere now, anonymous but eerily accurate. No photos, no direct identifiers, but the story's details matched her experience too closely to ignore. Entitled passenger learns a hard lesson. Karma at 35,000 feet in the air. Woman confronts air marshal mid-flight.
She read each one in silence, her stomach sinking further with every sentence. It was strange, she was both relieved that no one had named her and terrified that someone eventually would. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled. The comment sections were merciless. Strangers applauded the marshal. Others shared their own experiences with rude passengers. It had become a modern moral play, a story about justice, humility, and perspective. And though she told herself no one could prove it was her, a part of her knew the truth didn't need to be public to sting. Shame doesn't require an audience, it only needs memory. Across town, the air marshal started his morning like any other. Coffee, news briefings, a quiet run before sunrise. His phone buzzed occasionally, colleagues sending him links, teasing him with lines like, "You went viral and didn't even say anything." He chuckled softly, but said nothing. He didn't correct anyone. He didn't confirm anything. That was never his way. His job was silence, control through calm, authority through restraint. Still, he reflected on what happened, not with pride, but with a certain satisfaction, because stories like this one had a way of reaching people who needed to hear them. He'd seen too much of the other side of humanity, fear, panic, aggression, to dismiss small moments of justice when they appeared. What had happened on that plane wasn't grand or heroic. It was just truth meeting arrogance in a confined space where masks couldn't hold. By the afternoon, the story had evolved again. News sites began picking it up, sourcing it from social media posts. Titles appeared with the familiar cadence of internet morality tales. First-class passenger insults stranger, learns who he really is. Arrogant flyer's rant ends in instant regret. Air marshal teaches entitled passenger a lesson she'll never forget. Each version twisted slightly, as stories do. Some exaggerated the confrontation, others invented dialogue. But the core message remained, never judge who sits beside you. And that, the marshal thought, was good enough. He returned to his desk, filed his reports, and prepared for his next assignment, a red-eye flight 2 days later. He'd see hundreds of passengers again, each one a small mystery, each one carrying their own stories and assumptions. Most would be kind, a few perhaps less so. But every time he walked down a jet bridge now, he carried with him a quiet reminder of how quickly perception can turn. That sometimes the real lessons in civility don't come from authority, but from consequence. As for the woman, her world grew smaller for a while. Invitations slowed, conversations felt stilted. Even among friends, she sensed whispers. She told herself it was coincidence, but deep down she knew the truth moves faster than flight. Weeks passed before she flew again, and when she did, she didn't speak much at all. She boarded quietly, eyes down, voice polite. The attendant smiled, unaware of the ghost of her past flight lingering just beneath the surface. She sat in economy that time. By choice, she told herself, though the truth ran deeper. She didn't need extra legroom or champagne anymore. What she needed was anonymity. The plane took off smoothly. No turbulence, no drama, just the steady hum of engines and the faint glow of cabin lights. She looked out the window at the endless stretch of sky and thought about how small she had once made someone feel, someone who'd never deserved it. And though she'd never admit it out loud, somewhere deep inside, she was grateful she'd learned her lesson the way she had, without violence, without scandal, but with precision. Because some lessons are meant to hurt just enough to change you. The marshal never thought about her again. To him, it was another flight, another day, another reminder that decency is its own kind of armor. But to her, it was the day her reflection cracked, and for the first time, she saw herself clearly.
Months passed, seasons shifted, and though the world had long since moved on to other stories, other headlines, that flight, the confrontation, the silence, the moment of realization, remained frozen in memory for the few who had been there. Life continued quietly, as it always does after a storm. The airline went about its business, thousands of flights taking off and landing without incident. The passengers of Flight 287 scattered across the country, their lives intersecting for just those few hours before diverging again into anonymity. But some moments leave ripples that never fully fade. For the woman once seated in 2B, time didn't erase the experience, it merely softened its edges. The embarrassment had dulled, but it lingered just enough to whisper in moments of pride or impatience. It visited her in small ways, the way she hesitated before complaining at a restaurant, the way she stopped herself from cutting in line, the way she thought twice before assuming someone's worth from their clothes or tone. Change, after all, rarely arrives in grand gestures. It comes in small recalibrations, subtle shifts of conscience. Still, she never told anyone the full story. When friends brought up the viral plane incident, she laughed nervously and said she'd read about it too. She pretended it was amusing, some online exaggeration. Inside, though, every sentence of those retellings struck a little too close to home. There were nights when she replayed the flight in her mind, the boarding line, the quiet man beside her, the flash of the badge she hadn't understood until it was too late. And in those quiet reflections, a different kind of humility took root. Not the performative kind people post about online, but the quiet kind that changes the way someone moves through the world. For the first time in years, she began to listen more than she spoke. She learned the attendant's name that next time she flew. She said thank you to the gate agent, to the baggage handler, to the stranger who let her pass. None of it erased what had happened, but each act of decency was a small repayment for a debt she couldn't name. And somewhere she hoped, though she'd never admit it aloud, that maybe, just maybe, the man from 2A knew she was sorry. But he didn't. He never thought of her again, not in resentment, not in pity, simply not at all. His life was built on moving forward. He'd seen too many versions of the same story to hold on to any single one. Entitlement, fear, arrogance, they were all symptoms of the same human fragility. His work wasn't about judgment, it was about protection. He moved through airports the way a shadow moves across pavement, seen by none, watching all. Each flight was a new set of possibilities, a new collection of strangers, each carrying their own worlds in silence. Sometimes when he passed through first class during pre-boarding checks, he caught glimpses of familiar behavior, impatience, entitlement, subtle scorn, and it reminded him briefly of her. Not in anger, but as a quiet reminder of how thin the line can be between composure and chaos. He often wondered what people would do differently if they knew who sat beside them, if they realized that in the confined space of an airplane, status meant nothing, only behavior did. And that, perhaps, was the unspoken truth of his profession. He existed to keep peace among people who didn't always know how to keep it themselves. A few months after that fateful flight, during a routine briefing, one of his colleagues brought it up casually. The incident had become something of an unofficial legend within the department, a story told half-jokingly during downtime. "Did you ever see that video people made about it?" a younger agent asked with a grin. "They turned it into one of those YouTube story narrations. Millions of views." He chuckled softly. "Did they get it right?" "Mostly," the younger man said, "except they made you sound like some kind of action hero. I think they called it, 'Karen said people like you shouldn't sit in first class. Didn't know I was the air marshal on board?'" The room laughed. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. People love stories more than facts. And he meant it without bitterness. The story had taken on a life of its own, reshaped by the internet into a parable about instant karma and poetic justice. And maybe that was fine. Maybe the world needed stories like that. Reminders of humility disguised as entertainment. That night he went home and looked it up, out of curiosity, not vanity.
He found dozens of versions, videos, voiceovers, dramatic retellings. Some embellished wildly, others stayed close to truth. All carried the same message, that arrogance meets its reckoning, and that sometimes the quiet stranger beside you has more authority than you'll ever know. He watched one version all the way through. The narration was overly dramatic, the music swelling at every pause, but when it ended, he didn't laugh. He just sat in silence, reflecting on how strange it was to see his experience turned into folklore. He didn't mind, because for all its dramatization, it carried something real, something worth keeping. Not every story of justice has to end with punishment. Some end with perspective. Months later, he was assigned another flight to Atlanta. Same route, different passengers. The same hum of the engines, the same sunlight streaking through cabin windows. He took his usual seat in first class, different number this time, but near the front. He watched people board, the business travelers, the families, the tired parents, the anxious tourists, each face unique, each moment fleeting. Then, for just a second, he saw someone pause at the doorway, a woman, middle-aged, polite, quiet. She smiled nervously at the flight attendant and thanked her for the water bottle she was handed. She took a seat 2 rows back, not in first class this time. He didn't look long enough to be sure, but something in her posture, in the hesitation of her hands, felt familiar. He turned back toward the window, the faintest hint of a smile on his face. Maybe she'd learned. Maybe she hadn't. But in that moment, he realized it didn't matter, because the real measure of justice isn't in humiliation, it's in transformation. The engines roared to life. The plane began its ascent. Clouds enveloped them once again, erasing the ground, equalizing everyone inside. At 35,000 feet, no one was better, no one was lesser. Just people, suspended between earth and sky, learning, in their own ways, how to be decent.